for a mixed crowd, what I'd like to start with is the opinion that America needs a new FDR with the power to bring us all together. How's that sound? Anyone sound horrified by that? So, if we're sort of stepping back and rooting an idea like this in American history and American tradition, what we notice when we look at American history is that it comes in these interesting cycles where monarchy decays into oligarchy and then monarchy is reasserted again. So when we're looking for periods or moments or administrations in American history in which the White House is substantively in charge of the executive branch, what we see is basically Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, which is sort of has this interesting cyclic structure in which, FDR is much more powerful than Hoover, Lincoln is much more powerful than Buchanan, in which this interesting cyclical structure sort of looks like an earthquake fault that breaks repeatedly over time. And what we see when this fault breaks is we see a president who is elected under the usual forms, but due to some crisis becomes essentially a monarch. And in fact, the only one of these monarchs who even resigns is Washington. And so what we're seeing is actually, first of all, this is not really the idea of an American monarchy, is not at all a deviation from the American historical tradition. It's sort of completely consistent with the past, because what happens is that each of these monarchs essentially establishes a new regime. Like the regime that Washington creates does not really have anything to do with the Congress of the Confederation, which has been basically airbrushed out of history, which was the U.S. government until the adoption of the Constitution. That's more than a decade. Like, that it existed, and that's all you know. That's because it sucked. And because it sucked, it had to be replaced. And sort of this Lincoln is doing the same thing. He's replacing this old sort of agrarian regime designed mainly to be populated by like Southern gentlemen with something appropriate to an industrial state. FDR is taking this sort of decayed oligarchic old regime, like this Gilded Age regime that sort of looks very like a Chinese kind of regime in that, there's a lot of sort of kleptocracy, frankly. And also shit gets done extremely fast and gets extremely done, and also stuff is crazy. And, so FDR replaces it with sort of the modern government, we know the sort of the alphabet soup, as they called it then, of administrations. And again, it's much harder for FDR. It takes FDR a long time to actually really get control of the old agencies, as powerful as he is. Like, some people might, who know DC might be surprised to learn that one of the last holdouts of sort of the old regime is the State Department, which today is like sort of the center of kind of a new regime. Or what you might call, the French do this great thing of like numbering their republics. So, okay, on paper, the Constitution is consistent, but in practice, we've basically had, these 4 separate republics in this country. And so, to say, that you're a monarchist is basically to say that the cycle that has sort of constantly repeated itself should continue. But I think that's enough of a lecture, so I'll give it back to...
You can hold on to that one.
Can I ask a question or two already on this?
Please.
Why do we need another monarch? Why can't we have, if we're talking in those terms, we have somebody like an Oliver Cromwell who wasn't a monarch but was quite disruptive and changed things significantly. We are just coming out of somebody who wasn't around for very long in the U.S. but has made a fair bit of waves. Why do you need this benevolent, overarching monarch as opposed to somebody dynamic who comes in and shakes things up?
Because the person in the White House has very little power as it is sort of constituted today. The White House has very little power to shake things up. And, shake things up is a sort of good way to express it. I came to some of my beliefs and perspectives because I grew up as a child of D.C. My dad was in the Foreign Service. My mom was at DOE, and my stepdad was on the Hill. And so I was sort of, to some extent, have seen the system from below. And the way the State Department or any of the agencies regards the White House, the relationship with Congress is very important and very complicated. The way they regard the White House is like Imagine you're like a fish in a coral reef, and one day there's a hurricane. Okay, are you up there being tossed by the waves? No, you kind of sway back and forth a little bit. And you're like, I would really not like to sway back and forth again a lot. It interrupts my feeding. But, to say that any president has the power to reach down into this, even a president aligned with them. And so you might remember, do you know the name Ben Rhodes? He was Obama's kind of chief, sort of informal foreign policy guy. And Ben Rhodes, who is sort of completely aligned ideologically and mentally with these State Department people who they all grew up watching The West Wing. That's how they all think. Ben Rhodes is just like, I can't move these guys at all. He called them the blob, right? And so, in a sense, when even a president with the level of legitimacy and support from legitimate institutions that Barack Obama had can't move these people at all, anything that moves them, that changes the way they do business in any serious way, has to have levels of power that you just are far beyond anything in the conventional line.
Could I push back on this? It's
yes, please.
Basically, it seems to me a strength of the American system that we have divided powers so that when there's a majority or a strong majority sentiment in the populace, you get a majority in Congress, a majority in the Senate. This is what FDR had. He had supermajorities. And so through that combined will, you can institute a broad program, and that is perhaps, has kind of equivalent somewhat to what a dictator can do, but it also has accountability, and it has, things can change in 2 years when the House is reconstituted, for example.
I think it's important to, my sort of preferred design of a political system or any management system would be what I would call an accountable monarchy. So I basically agree with that combination of accountability and, which is the way basically every company in the world is run also as an accountable monarch, because you have a board of directors. It's slightly different and unusual to do. Doing that at the sovereign level is a lot harder. But there are still clever things that can be done. But yeah, essentially having that, the problem is not, the reason why, if you look at the world around you, everything that works, everything that is made by a monarchy. If you drive a car, it is made by a monarchy because it is made by a corporation with a CEO. If you buy an iPad, your iPad is actually made by a monarchy, which is Apple, in a monarchy, which is China. If you go to the post office, not so much. If you go to the public schools, not so much. And so, you see that things that are run in a sort of way, when things are run by an oligarchy or a bureaucracy, what you get is a complete sort of dissolution of responsibility. When you say, for example, who is responsible for this insane 20-year war in Afghanistan? There's absolutely no answer to that question. And so you actually have this system where these structures cannot be displaced. They have effectively zero accountability. The agencies, if you go to anyone and try this experiment, go to Washington, talk to someone who works at DC and say, we don't have an executive branch, we have a legislative branch. The agencies respond to Congress. They testify before Congress. They don't testify in the White House. They get basically press releases from the White House. And, whereas Congress micromanages their budget and their personnel to a degree that is just, absurd. And with line item appropriations and so forth. And so really, if you wanted to change the State Department, for example, as an executive, you have to recognize that the whole structure and budget of the State Department is the law. And in the executive branch, you have to follow the law, which means that you actually have no power at all over the executive branch. Furthermore, when you get to, the point about Congress and divided powers, you might know that the incumbency rate in the House of Representatives is roughly 98%. In the Senate, it's a little bit over 90%. Moreover, the way those structures actually work, they're not actually parliamentary bodies where people debate and convince each other. They're systems of committees. And, of course, as a freshman in the House or the Senate, you're subject to this seniority principle in which you have no power essentially at all, and the people that have power basically make, Konstantin Chernenko look like Giga Chad. And Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein, who are of, questionable mental competence. And so it doesn't matter because they're not actually doing anything. Everything is done by their staffs. But, of course, you'll have this seniority turnover when they pass away. And so sort of regarding this as this incredible thing that is Washington today is sort of the construct of the people that signed the Constitution, every one of these people would look at this thing and be like shoot it very gently and politely and pleasantly in the head.
Two things here. The first is are there political solutions? What is the problem trying to be solved specifically before we get into the systems? And secondly, when you say that and it would be an accountable monarchy, like at a company, the board of directors can kick the CEO out. So
That's
who kicks
right.
the monarch out in this system?
I need something very like a board of directors, except that you have the additional problem that in a company, the CEO can't arrest the board of directors.
Yeah, that's my main question.
Yeah.
So I think when people think of a monarchy and they think of like that they have that, and I don't want to do that. It's
right
because he's the king, and like if a bunch of people think he should leave, it's off with all your heads. Whereas in a company, the board of directors just says, "F you, you're a bad CEO."
And in a functional company, the board of directors does nothing ever. The board of directors is not corporate governance; it's corporate accountability. It's like a backup system. And furthermore, there are plenty of companies that actually don't have this backup system because the CEO controls the board, such as, for example, Meta and Google. So basically, many companies, and they don't seem to work terribly different from the other ones, have actually effectively disabled this system, this accountability system, and they still basically don't work. I think it's actually possible. In the past, this has definitely been sort of one of the many imperfection forms of historical monarchies, even though monarchy is by far the most common system of government in human history. You can certainly look at many, many kinds of failure cases. And often these have to do with sort of the biological hereditary monarchy. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, said that the period under which humanity had enjoyed the best government was the period of the 5 good emperors, the Antonine emperors, which lasted for well over 100 years, from Hadrian, I guess, through Marcus Aurelius. And so, to say, like one thing that people will definitely do when they think about forms of government is that they'll exercise what some people call recency bias. And so they'll kind of look at the past through a fisheye lens in which anything in the last 75 years is much more important than anything in the rest of the last millennium. And so, Hitler is much more important than Elizabeth I. And when you look at that, you definitely get very bad results for monarchy because you have to, account for all the 20th century dictators as monarchs. And so you basically need a theory of why that was such a total shit show. It's sort of like if you're developing a drug and you're like, the purpose of this drug is to cure people, but like, I gave this drug to rabbits and like 80% of the rabbits died. But the other 20% were cured. You're like, okay, let me figure out how to get to 20% without the 80%, And that's actually a great result for a drug developer. It's a shitty result for a pharmacist. And that's sort of one of the ways in which we need to think about sort of the role of a monarchy today. You're asking basically very good questions.
Go ahead.
I want to jump in here for just 1 second because I think there's an area where your idea of this monarchy and monarchies in general overlaps with right to repair, actually, which is the power of the individual. A monarchy puts a lot of power on the individual. In fact, maybe it's the best system of individualism, but right to repair is something where ultimately you're protecting individuals' rights to have access to their devices, to not be talked down by some top-down corporation. So I wonder if a modern-day monarchy is something that I wonder what that would look like, and if it would still maintain that power of the individual.
Monarchy seems like the power to the monarch, not to the individual, unless the individual you're talking about.
But the monarch is an individual. Yeah. I mean, can I try to translate it's an interesting idea which I haven't sort of heard before. Let me translate it into terms which might be slightly more accessible. So one of the things that you see, you may know something about movies. So in movies, there's something called the auteur theory. And the auteur theory in movies is that basically anytime you try to direct a movie with a committee, it's going to fail. And basically, absolute creative control needs to be given to one person to make an effective movie. And so if you compare sort of the auteur theory of film to, one of the sort of better and less known in some ways dictators of the 20th century, do you know Kemal Ataturk was? So Ataturk, which his name means Father Turk in Turkish, classic fascist period, 20s through 50s, 20s through 50s, Turkish dictator, father of the word Ataturk really means Father Turk. His real name was Mustafa Kemal. He has so much power that he changes the dress code in Turkey. He's like, we will no longer wear fezzes. We will wear modern clothes. He changes the alphabet. He's like, why are we writing Turkish in an Ottoman alphabet? Let's write it in the Latin alphabet. Like, that's a level of power. I mean, I guess there are people who regulate the words we use these days, but that's a level of power that is very, very high. And, and when you look at basically Ataturk's practices as a dictator, Ataturk created the Turkey that we have today. There were no, he wasn't involved in the Armenian genocide. There wasn't, and so when you compare Ataturk to FDR, who has a similar level of sort of impact on this country, you're, I think, really getting sort of a scale for, how much power is needed here.
So one of the things that you had you had compared it to a company, and then you had compared it to, let's say, directing a movie. And I agree with the idea that when you try to direct something by committee or have 8 people do something, when one person should be making the decision in that particular instance,
today's Turkey is basically Ataturk's work of art.
I guess my point is, if you have in these situations, let's say I wasn't in a board of directors at my nonprofit where they could kick me out. Let's just say I had shares in everything. If I do something stupid or I do something horrible, I have control over a small domain. And I think the reason, right now in our system of government, the reason we consider monopolies bad is because if you have one company with one director that can control everything, this is bad. And the issue with government is there's only one. You can't have multiple monarchs in a country. You can't have multiple governments.
Yeah,
so it makes monarchies.
So you need, exactly. That's called a fallacy that the Romans called imperium in imperio. Basically, when you divide authority, you have basically a struggle between powers. And the one thing you don't want is a struggle between powers, right? And so, the question of, I guess the point to emphasize is how rarely this actually goes wrong in companies and how rarely the board of directors actually needs to act in a normal company. And this suggests that sort of most people's worry about finding a benevolent dictator is in a way misplaced, because it's hire an executive search firm. They're not going to send you a psycho. They're going to send you someone who could be CEO of a Fortune 500 company.
But there's an important distinction between companies and government, which is that with companies, you can easily change your service provider. You can vote with your dollars. You can just switch entirely. You're not guaranteed to be subject to it in a certain locality. So it calls to mind the perspective of Robert Nozick. So he talked about meta-utopia in his book, Anarchy State Utopia. And so in principle, I agree that all of these institutions are run by monarchs effectively, and, for example, benevolent dictators for life in open source projects. But there's the accountability is deeply present. You're never compelled to participate. And so in Nozickian meta-utopia, it could be beautiful if you always have the right to exit, and it's practical to be able to exit, so you're never subject to a tyranny. But the problem is, do you have that in the real world? You have a house, you have a family, you have community, and so how can you exit? And the seasteading is basically the most practical version of this that exists in political thought today, I think. And so that's the problem, is government, the terrible servant, the dangerous servant, the terrible master. How can we have it be accountable and powerful?
Well, 2 things. One is that I think that both of these forms of accountability are good to have. I think that you should distinguish between accountability with a board of directors-like system, which is great and necessary, and distinguish between that and a Nozickian sort of exit-based structure. And it's clearly better to have more of these structures rather than fewer. It's clearly better to have a higher granularity of these things, and it's clearly better to have sort of more entry and exit structures. Those structures have to be, consistent with maintaining a sort of stable international order. They shouldn't be things that can be weaponized against each other. But with that restriction, I definitely think that, in my sort of ideal international world, you'd get entry and exit rights. You'd have to basically, the country you want to go to has to want to have you in, and the country that you're leaving has to let you leave. And the situations, if you're in prison, you can't leave. So there are sort of situations in which exit is sort of not a universal right, but kind of a general right. For example, if two nations are at war, it makes no sense to have migration between them. That's just a very weird phenomenon. And so sort of all of these things are kind of qualified under, like these issues have sort of already been addressed in the kind of old international law of the like Westphalian world, like Grotius or Vattel. It's a totally different, I don't want to go down that rat hole, but it's a totally different, conception of international law. And so you want to have these sort of subtle forms of accountability. That said, like lock-in is really extremely common in like the business world. Like you can easily get locked into Chipotle. And, this does not mean that like the CEO of Chipotle is going to be like, I'm going to poison the burritos, right? Which is sort of one of the things when we have
because
these fears,
they lose market share when
they lose market
happens.
share, right? But the thing is, when we look at like bad government in the 20th century, there is a lot of I'm going to poison the burritos, right? And so you basically, when you're looking at using this analogy, you have to have a clear sense of why this is not going to start poisoning the burritos.
Could we move in this direction? Because I agree in principle that like localism and city states is a beautiful solution because then you have more choice. You can have local community and local politics. Couldn't you move in that direction without upending the constitutional order? For example, we could have better elections, a better voting method that produces more competitive elections, that produces better representation, that produces better policy, that produces a move towards this localism.
I think the gap between representation and policy is extremely hard because the system is extremely well fortified, as both Donald Trump and Barack Obama found in very different ways against exterior input. Washington is extremely well fortified against politics. And, one of the reasons to say there's no political solution, or one of the ways to say there's no political solution, is just to think a little bit about the word politics. One of the things that are little thought experiments that I like to lead people through is to think about the words politics and democracy. And you'll notice that one of these words has a positive connotation and one of them has a negative connotation. To democratize anything is good, but to politicize it is bad. And yet they're synonyms. And so, when you're basically saying, we're going to democratize the government, you're saying we're going to give politicians more control over the government. We're going to give Donald Trump control over the Justice Department. Wait, that makes no sense.
Is there even necessarily an issue when it comes to representation? Because I'll hear people say, Congress has this low an approval rating. A lot of people don't like how things are going. But is it like the way the American system seems to work is that something only gets done when a lot of people agree? And I think the reality, and I'm going to steal Destiny's take here because he's supposed to be the one sitting here to begin with, is that so many people fundamentally disagree. So when you have gridlock in the system, that gridlock is a accurate representation of the fact that many people in this room probably disagree with each other on a bunch of issues, and if they discussed them, would probably be arguing until midnight. Like there's a reason for limiting the power of the executive, because when we are in such a state of disagreement, perhaps it is not the time to move forward with any one particular thing.
So that's basically a good case for an oligarchy in a way, and that's essentially the case against politics, and that's the case if you look at where this pejorative, connotation of the word politics comes from. It's very old. It goes back well through to the early 20th century, and you'll see early progressive writers, early progressive like muckrakers talking about like Boss Tweed and all of this stuff, and the sort of corrupt, scumbags with their political machines who made the late 19th century and early 20th century run. And, let's be clear, they were corrupt scumbags. And so when you're basically saying, one way to translate what you just said is to say that democracy doesn't work anyway. So it's better to basically disconnect the wire that comes from the voting machine and let the institutions handle the problem. Let's think about, a specific thing, COVID. Let's imagine we had direct democracy on COVID. And COVID policy was set by a national vote, every month or something. It would have been insane. It would have been you're oh yeah, we have a public of virologists. No, we don't. We have a public that is just swayed by the last thing they saw on MSNBC or Fox, or trusting this group would be idiotic. And yet we also see that the oligarchic, system, these institutions which arguably gave us COVID in the first place and then came up with masks are a bad idea for all of January and February 2020, is also that's not a great result either, right? And so I think that when you hear critiques sort of Destiny's critique of democracy there, can you really put the public in charge? The answer is, of course, you can't put the public in charge. And I just wish that critique was sort of expressed maybe a little more frankly.
I don't even think it's an issue of the public being in charge. I think it's that when the system is gridlocked, let's say something doesn't happen, that something even worse can happen, which is somebody just says, okay, since nothing is getting done and we're not moving forwards, let's do what I want to do, and what I want to do may move things backwards. So let's say that you do have somebody with that level of executive power, and they decide that in West Texas that there is a mask and a vaccine mandate and every business is closed, and that in New York City abortion is banned. I think you may actually wind up with way more conflict, way more hate, and dare I say it, way more bloodshed than what you have right now.
This is another great argument against democracy. I mean, it's sort of absolutely. But the thing is, you have to bear in mind that when the political system in Washington is, quote, gridlocked, that doesn't mean that Washington does nothing. That means that Washington basically steers straight ahead. And, the set of course corrections that you can basically apply to this oil tanker are really quite minimal. And Donald Trump tried to turn it very erratically to starboard, and Barack Obama tried to turn it a little bit to port. And I think Obama, in terms of exerting influence from the White House on the executive branch, clearly much more successful than Trump. On the other hand, he's telling them to do what they want to do already. On the other hand, if the White House hadn't existed at all during this period, and DOD had kept DODing and state had kept stating, I don't think that anyone would have noticed any significant difference. And so, I think that when you recognize, I think Destiny's right. I think that when you recognize that basically the natural state of the system is gridlock, what you're saying is that it's okay to disconnect the wire to the voting machine, to the political branch, because politics can't do anything about the system anyway.
I have a question here about local governance versus federal governance, central power versus decentralized power. I feel like a monarchy system might work really well for one city or one city state. Where does that fit into a central planning versus city states type system?
I think more granularity is generally better. I don't think it's hard for a high granularity system. You might think of the Italian Renaissance or Germany in the 16th century or something, and a lot of good things come out of those systems of competing regimes. And so and they seem to end when those regimes are consolidated under one power. And so you sort of want structures that will guarantee that, not at the cost of having an overarching structure that's going to basically just reduce all of them to local parades in the way that the Roman Empire does. And so that's a sort of difficult kind of problem in designing utopias that kind of needs to be addressed in any such design. But I think your intuition that sort of these large structures really aren't necessary is interesting. I mean, for example, if you look at, say, San Francisco, imagine a San Francisco in which the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, is actually the mayor of San Francisco and can basically has absolute power in San Francisco. I think it would be interesting to try that. I mean, she's of course she's not a Republican. I think it would be interesting to try that experiment, and I think people would be shocked at how different the results would be.
I'd like to back up to the very beginning. You outlined 3 monarchies. George Washington, and three tragedies with them. George Washington, who steadied a ship after the Revolution quite well. Abraham Lincoln, who went through more commanders-in-chief than I have toes to count them. Had he not prolonged the war by his ineffective choice of commanders-in-chief, 30% of the regiment of volunteers in my part of New York would not have died from diarrhea. Then you have FDR, who the St. Louis Federal Reserve did a great report about how his policies prolonged the Depression rather than shorten it up. And he obviously had the Depression in World War II. If we usher in a fourth monarchy, what is your preferred tragedy to go with it?
I think that it's easy to diagnose these things in retrospect. I like to talk about, I'm not sure my perspective on the overall works of Lincoln and FDR is that different from yours.
Well, let's stick with the next one then. If you'd like to see the fourth monarchy, what terrible problem is going to accompany that the monarch solves? What would you like to see happen?
I think that when, Marx, I'm not a big fan of Marx, but Marx had some great lines. And one of his great lines is that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so when you're sort of comparing, this fourth American monarchy or fifth American monarchy, if you count George III, when you're comparing this kind of regime change within the system that is very characteristic of the American system, just because the Constitution is so ambiguous about the powers of branches that it's very easy to read the Constitution in a way that renders the Congress and the Supreme Court simply advisory bodies. And so it's actually very easy to justify. Washington, the Constitution was written for Washington. The Constitution was written as this reactionary coup against the insane Jacobinical, basically, Congress of the Confederation. And it was very much an ideological thing. And there were people who wanted Washington to declare himself king. And they were just this democracy thing is crazy and it doesn't work. And so in some ways, the design that is closest to the design of the founders is going to be, the Washington-Hamilton, administration. And the relationship between Washington and Hamilton looks a lot like the relationship between, say, Eric Schmidt and Larry Page. Basically, Washington is providing the gravitas and Hamilton is the CEO. Washington is more like the chairman of the board than the president. So you have this very much, America is established as this kind of working autocracy whose organs live on beyond, the life of Hamilton. But that to me is a very, that regime gets an A, the Lincoln and FDR get an A from me.
Yeah,
but the next one will be totally different from any of them, as they are different from each other.
But I'd like the question answered, okay? Rather than jump into some of that. If you want to go with Marx, Jean-Baptiste Vico beat him on the cyclical theory of history and the new science by centuries, okay? So let's go back further there. But it's 2022. If you'd like to see another monarch come in, it seems to have to be accompanied by a sufficiently difficult issue for that monarch to make a difference.
I think there's a huge difference. I think there's a huge. Let me back you up there because I don't actually agree with that, and here's why. I think that the nature of the American voter has changed very fundamentally in a way that will make any further transition very, very different from previous transitions. Because I think that when you look at the voters, at the citizens of the United States and these other transitions, these are people that are almost infinitely less apathetic. They're far more violent. At the time of the Civil War, both sides are really itching to start shooting at each other. This is not something that is happening at present in our cold Civil War. People have much more energy. They're much more used to sort of acting in a kind of paramilitary way. And their just capacity for mob action is much greater. And even in the United States. And so, I mean, if
So
you
like
watch
John
like a
Brown?
political ticker tape parade from that day and age, that would be like comical in the present day. And so what people today have that those people don't have, we've sort of lost this like tremendous violent sincerity. But what we've gained is we've gained this incredible capacity for like cosmopolitan irony. We have the most ironic electorate citizenship in the history of the universe. And so that says to me that, and you see some hints of this in the political transitions of 1989 in Eastern Europe, that says to me that there will be a sort of ironic, ludic quality about the next transition, which is certainly not found in Washington, Lincoln, or FDR.
So, from my reading history, paramilitary activity did increase a lot before the Civil War. You can read about the Wide Awakes as the major organizing force. They originally arose to protect speakers who were being intervened and shouted down by the pro-slavery camp, basically. And the combination of those factors precipitated the Civil War. So, I agree with you that if our system collapses, or if we have broad agreement, then we can have something akin, we can try something akin to a dictator or an accountable dictatorship through a unification of through all the branches of government.
So suppose this candidate, for example, I don't know if this is, I'm not an election lawyer, I don't know if this is possible. Suppose such a candidate ran in both primaries as basically a unifying candidate.
Yeah, that's possible in 2 states that have fusion balloting. New York.
Yeah, but even
yeah.
without a fusion ballot, does being on one party's primary prevent you from being on another one's? I mean, so basically you'd say I'm a Republican and I'm a Democrat and I'm here to bring this country together.
Yeah. You're saying most states don't allow that. New Hampshire is one counterexample, but all but 2 states.
Sure, run your wife on the other ballot. Right, I mean,
this happened in Argentina. Argentina's had 20% inflation for 20 years or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so but the desire for I would say that most people who are politically active in the world today are politically active because they're afraid of the opposite party, and that sort of mutual fear. It's like characteristic of any kind of broken relationship. It's like basically blue state voters vote. I went down to the abortion demonstration today. Blue state voters vote because they're afraid of red state voters. Red state voters vote because they're afraid of blue state voters. That's all of politics. That's all that's left. It's just the Cold Civil War.
But when we discuss the concept of gridlock in government and people voting for the other party because they're afraid of what one may do, is that an argument for more federalized power or less federal power? Because I think if there's more federal power, if there's anything resembling a monarchy, and again, like abortion is banned in New York City, or there's a mask and vaccine mandate in Texas, that would be even worse than the system we have now. Because when there's federal gridlock, state governments can still move forward, and that's how we've been able to stay together, by having 50 different governments that are able to disagree on certain things and have a small section of core beliefs. It sounds like this is an argument for less federal reach and less federal control, so that somebody in Texas doesn't have to be afraid of what somebody in New York says or votes, and vice versa, rather than more.
Well, I mean, the actual power of federalism, or the power of states to diverge from the way from sort of a shared federal standard of government, obviously has been going downward since the 1850s. And so, the sense in which if you're an advocate for that, you're certainly not, you can't really be an advocate for, the way in which the federal government overrode local legislation in the South in the 1960s. And so it's sort of hard to reverse the growth of sort of centralization in that sense. It's hard to say, okay, well, the Solid South will live again. Like, no, the Solid South will not live again. And sorry, Texas. And so when you basically talk about rolling back the growth of centralization, I think you need to acknowledge that that's a very hard thing to do. And often when you give power back to people, they don't even want it. So, for example, that logic would also lead you to support Brexit. Which
I support, incidentally.
Sorry?
which I do support.
Okay, I respect support for Brexit, but Brexit did not exactly return powers to Whitehall that Whitehall wanted. It returned very little to MPs. If you look at how life on the ground in reality has changed in Britain because of Brexit, you're just some people have some more stupid paperwork to deal with. But is England charting its new course in the world? Is it doing something different? Has life on the street in England changed because of Brexit? I would be very surprised if you were to claim that the answer was yes.
So the premise of the talk here is there a political solution? And I do not think adopting a monarchy is a political solution. I think every generation has a responsibility, and it falls on particular generations particularly, to restore the system that they live with and live under, and to renew it and make it better. And we have to make this system better by improving accountability for elected officials, improving our representation, and working towards the decentralization of power. And we've seen that in many arenas. We've seen improvement in handgun licensing through the state-level action. We've seen improvement in gay marriage through state-level action. These have happened over the past 20 years. We've seen, there's Supreme Court decisions which are changing, which have decentralized a major issue to the states. So
here's a question that I can ask about that, which is, of all of these victories, what percentage of the things that Washington does has this affected? Has these victories affected?
They've affected the lives of many people who carry guns and are able to defend themselves because of it, who got married, etc.
They've these things, these changes in various directions, have really changed. But in terms of basically their impact on what DC does, how much of what DC does has changed as a result of these waves?
I think there's an opportunity to act in different ways which lead to major changes. So for example, specifically I'm addressing agorism. So agorism is the idea that by embracing and enhancing the black market, you can produce greater political change than by engaging with a system that is corrupted in many ways. And so examples of that are Bitcoin as a critique of monetary policy, 3D printed firearms as a critique of gun control. And it goes on, the Silk Web or the Silk Road as a drug market online, etc. That's the path that I see having most promise, the greatest promise to make the greatest change in federal government.
Sure, but how much power has that taken? I mean, one way to measure taking power away from other people is simply how many of them you can get fired, for example. And so, when you take power away from East Germany, everyone in the Stasi gets fired. Every institution disappears. And, what I see is that, sort of all of the waves that you can make from the private world that affect Washington, they'll certainly make the fish sway back and forth a little bit. But, I think that when you said it's sort of our responsibility to fix the system, the thing that I immediately heard was sort of the thinking of Soviet dissidents in 1984, where there were almost no Soviet dissidents who were the Soviet Union has to fall. They were all we have to fix this, the grain program has to be corrected, market mechanisms need to be introduced. And, when the whole thing just collapses and everyone was thank God that was over, that's a complete surprise to even the anti-Soviet intellectuals.
If I may, Ben, I think you're saying that the solutions are technological.
I think many of the levers that we have that are most powerful are through creating new ways of being that interact with the system but work around it entirely.
And so to the Soviet Union, everybody was also expecting it to be this sort of violent end to this regime, but it was actually this sort of peaceful disillusionment, relatively speaking.
Sure.
And I think that's because there was this economic force of capitalism or of, I don't even know all the factors, but there was this outside force, like you're saying, that kind of weaved around this regime and made it lose all its teeth.
I would also say that the mass civil violence of the last 250 years is historically anomalous. I don't think that civilized populations in peacetime generally are capable of mass violence at all. Certainly for the whole period of the Roman Empire, there was no capacity for mass violence, no capacity for the kind of rioting that would like restore democracy or anything like that. You had basically pacified, domesticated, tamed populations, and that's what we're looking at today. And so in a way, sort of everyone associates revolution and regime change, and even if it's within the existing forums, with a lot of violence, and everyone was very surprised when the Soviet Union fell without violence. But that was actually a much more backward, violent, less civilized society than ours. And that's why I think it's possible to have regime change without any violence at all.
I agree we have significant challenges to our constitutional order, particularly as represented by the factionalism that's present in, as you see in the Cultural War. The Founding Fathers addressed this in Federalist Number 10, which talks about the mitigating factors against factionalism. And some of those factors have fallen away in our mass media, mass culture, national online existence. It enables these movements to gain more adherence and whatnot. And so we have a real challenge in front of us in terms of figuring out how to operate in this environment. But I believe that we are moving towards a solution through cultural alternatives like this one, through political changes like improving the voting method, through other such decentralization, through technology, et cetera.
Here's a question. What would cause you to believe that the American experiment had failed and that it hadn't worked out?
Well, I think I think the kind of exit scenario for the federal government is when the states choose to secede because the demands or obligations of the central government are greater than the desire to leave. And on that front, I think we've made significant steps in the right direction by further decentralizing certain decisions to the state level. And so the distance between the federal government and the state government has decreased in the recent past. And I think further moves in that direction can improve our prospects for the longevity of the federal government?
I'd say it's failed once somebody who is productive and talented is not able to say that they have a feeling of safety, either physical safety or food and other safety, in spite of their
contribution,
participation in society.
Great. Let's move forward from there.
Well, Rossmann, you talked a lot about on your YouTube channel how to make it in New York is almost impossible as a business owner having a repair shop. You've talked about all the struggles, all the regulations, all the bureaucracy you have to deal with there. I don't think it's outlandish to say we might be approaching that point that you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about when I'm afraid to walk outside of my house because somebody's going to smack me with a bat and take everything out of my house, or I'm unable to get food and water even though I'm able to work.
That isn't something regularly. That could happen in New York. That thing with the bat. Depends where you are, I guess.
Only in Bensonhurst in the 70s.
Only in Bensonhurst in the 70s.
There's a reason many people have left New York, and this is one of them.
Indeed.
So if one of our goals is one of our ways of judging change is that people lose their jobs in the federal government, I think the greatest lever on that front is taking away the Federal Reserve's ability to print money, because
I think if you took away that's a really deep economic rabbit hole to go into, because there are all these strange things like basically guaranteeing your bank deposits is done by the Federal Reserve's potential ability to print money. That's how it basically insures FDIC. So FDIC is effectively insured by informal financial instruments, which is deranged. On the other hand, if you take away those informal financial instruments, if you took them away right now, everyone should run out of this room and go to the ATM.
Minimize your dependency on the banking system is my advice.
But it's just one of these very deranged and old things that's like, why do we have troops in Germany, right? Why do we need to protect ourselves against Angela Merkel and her, and the answer is because we do, right?
Right. Well, we know that we're not stationing troops in Germany to protect us from the Germans. So
do we know that? But when Trump was like, "Let's pull the troops out of Germany," I'm the commander in chief. Do it. Of course, they trumped him, and we're like, "We'll study that."
Right.
Even people in Europe said, "Well, now we know who our real friends are." So it didn't even seem like they liked the idea of troops leaving.
Yeah,
I forget exactly who said it, but some some European politicians say, well, now we know who our friends are, in a really passive-aggressive way. And it's like, you want our troops
It
in
would
your
have an
country?
interesting effect, I think, on German politics if you pulled the bases out of Germany.
Yeah.
And it would have an even more interesting effect if you pulled the embassy out of Germany and said, hey, Germans, if we want to talk to you, we'll Zoom or something, right?
I'm just so dissatisfied by so many of these answers because they leave a tremendous amount of room. Like, there are important aspects to them that just get completely glossed over. So, for example, when you were talking about Brexit, you said, do you think that's happened? Do you think that's returned power? Why does that have to happen in 3-4 years? Why can't that be a 20-year process? Why can't it be a 50-year process? Why do we have to judge something like very complex like the Vietnam War by what happened in 72 or 73 as opposed to, hey, 50 years later, things are quite a bit better there? Why putting an arbitrary bound on something like that is ridiculous.
I think it's because it's hard to sort of control these. It's like easy to think when we think from a world outside, like the coral reef, like the fish should do this, the fish should do that, the sharks could go here, the sharks could go there.
I think it's just hard to answer the question.
Is very limited. Sorry, what was that?
I think it's just hard to answer the question.
It's
I think it's hard to swim around coral reefs.
It's hard.
I think it's a question that you couldn't answer.
These sharks, there's no control over them. There's no regular power by which they are told what to do. And so to basically say, like, okay, we're going to put a hook in your mouth, shark, and we're going to drag you around from here to there, like you could do that with 2 or 3 sharks, but the whole system that they work in is basically designed to defend itself from what you or I think. And so in a way to think they should go here, they should go there, is not a productive way to think when you're not actually... The way most people think about democracy is that democracy is absolutely the most powerful force in the state, which is true only in theory. Oligarchy is the most powerful force in the state. The blob, as Ben Rhodes put it. And so when you're imagining, like, it's like imagining, like, you're Elizabeth II and you're, like, off with his head, right? Well, to even get to the point where off with his head is a meaningful statement, you have to change your role in the way that things work. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
Well, everything about sharks swimming around the coral reef, I don't have any clue at all what that meant or what the relevance is on the question that this panel is about. I mean, maybe other people understand it. I was getting a PhD in political science at Boston University, and I can't process it.
But you've probably heard of the administrative state, and by sharks swimming around the coral reef, I mean the administrative state. And so the question is basically, what is the power that the executive branch can have over the administrative state? And then, because there's no other, practical angle for the electorate to control the administrative state, it has to go through the presidency. And so the amount of democracy that you have is at least bounded by the control of the White House over the administrative state. Does it make a little more sense than the sharks and the...
Another way of describing it is that the government has grown in one direction to be a larger percentage of GDP, a larger employment.
That's also true. That's also true. But in the days of FDR, the president could tell what the sharks what to do. Like, nobody defied FDR in the executive branch that he created. Like, that was just not a thing. Like, he would destroy you.